Hey guys, it's Andrew. In our last video, we used the map permissions to list function that we had previously created, and we used that inside of a checklist component in React. And we created this component which would render groups of checkboxes in a pretty functional way using Ramda to compose most of our JSX. However, at the end of our video, we realized that we're getting an error from React. The problem is that we are setting a value for the checked attribute in our React components, but we have no OnChange Handler here to deal with the checking or unchecking when these checkboxes are clicked. So what we're going to do here is add an OnChange Handler, and we're going to do that, again, using Ramda as much as possible. Right now, our checklist component only takes a single parameter, and that is data, which is our sets of permissions. What we also want to take as a parameter, though, is an onChange function. And this is a function that we will call whenever someone changes one of the values in these checkboxes. Basically, whenever someone checks or unchecks a box. The parent component of checklist is going to know about it. It's actually going to receive, as a parameter to onChange, the current state of all of our checkboxes. Let's go down here to where we actually render our checklist. And after our data parameter here, we'll just add onChange. And for now, that's just going to be console.log. But of course, we would probably want something else in a bigger application. So now we actually have to handle our onChange event. Now, we add an onChange attribute to our input element here, but we're not just going to pass onChange because that would just return the raw event object. Instead, let's create another function here called HandleChange. And right at the top here, let's write our HandleChange function. This HandleChange function is, of course, going to take our event object, and it's responsible for taking the data that we have received, modifying it with whatever value was just checked or unchecked, and then passing that to onChange. Now, in the project where I'm using this component, I'm using Redux to manage the application state, and so when we call onChange here, the parent component is actually going to fire an action, which will cause the state change to be saved, and then checklist here will be re-rendered. So whenever we are in HandleChange here, there's only going to be one checkbox that's different from whatever value it has in data. And of course, we have a reference to that checkbox through our event object here. Now, there's a feature of Ramda that we're going to use that we haven't looked at yet, and that is lenses. Lenses can be a little bit tricky the first time you're introduced to them. So before we actually get to work inside HandleChange here, let me take you over to the Ramda REPL. This is just something you can find on the Ramda website where you can give Ramda a try for yourself before actually using it in your project. So within functional programming, lenses are really useful for reaching inside complex data structures like objects and arrays and modifying just one little piece of that. And of course, when I say modify, we're not talking about mutating data. We're talking about making a new copy with a little bit of a difference. But the point is, we can reach inside an object to change one property or one item at a certain index or something like that. Let me show you how this works. What we do first is create a lens that is made specifically to look for a certain property. So for example, let's create an age lens. The age lens is going to look specifically at the age property on an object. And we can say ramda.lensProp age. LensProp creates a lens based on a specific property name. We're also going to use the lensIndex function back in our React component, which takes a number and works on arrays. So there are three functions in Ramda that are made to work with lenses. And those functions are view, set, and over. And they each have a specific job. So view is the simplest. What you can do with view is pass it a lens and pass it an object, and it will return whatever property inside that object that the lens is meant to look at. And so as you can see in our output here, we have 26 because the lens is looking for the age, and so it just returns the value of the age. The next one is ramda.set. This takes a lens, and it also takes a value to replace the current value of that lens with. So if we pass it 27 and person, it will return a new object, which is basically a clone of the old one, except the property that the lens looks at changed to whatever value we passed in as the second parameter. So we have our person object with the age of 27 instead of 26. Finally, we have over. Over is just like set, except as the second parameter, it expects a function instead of an object. And that function will receive the current value of the property as its parameter, and whatever we return from that function will be the new value for the property. So we can pass in the age lens, and then we can pass ramda.add, and I could pass it 10 as the first parameter. Ramda.add expects 2 parameters, so that means we'll get a curried function here, which will take the age property value as its second parameter. And so you can see the person object that is returned has an age of 36 instead of 26 because we've added 10. Okay, so let's go back to our checklist component and let's talk about how we can use lenses to make updating our data object here very simple. But first, let's remind ourselves, what is the structure of this data object? It's an object, and it has the group names as the keys, and then as the parameters, it has an array of objects. Now those objects have 3 values. We have the value, which is the full name of the permission as it is stored in the database. So if we look up here, that means group1-perm1, group2-perm1, or just perm3, for example. Then we also have a label, which is just the permission name, so perm1, perm2, etc. And then we have a Boolean value, which is checked, which is, of course, either true or false. Here's what we're going to do. Let's start by creating a perms lens, and this is just going to be a lens for an index, and that'll be the index of 1. The reason we're going to do this is because when we use the toPairs object on our data structure here, this is going to be converted into an array of pairs, and the array is going to have an array where the first item is the group name, and the second item is the value of the group key, which is of course the array of permissions. So we can use this permissions lens to look specifically inside this list of permissions. Then, once we're looking at individual permissions, we're going to be interested in looking at their value, because their value is going to match the value of that input, and also, of course, looking at their checked value. So we're going to have a value lens, which will be the lens for the property value, and we're also going to need a checked lens, which will be the lens for the property checked. Now let's write a handy little function we're going to call isPerm, of course short for isPermission. What we need to know is the permission object that we're currently looking at the one that was changed by the checking that the user just did? So of course the way we know which permission the user checked is by looking at e.target, which is the checkbox that was clicked, .value to get their value. And what we want to do is compare that with the value of the permission itself. And we're going to do this very simply. We can take a permission, which I'll just call P temporarily, and we can say r.equals, and we're going to see if it equals e.target.value, and we can find the value itself by using view. And we can use view passing it the value lens, and of course the second parameter to view should be the permission that we passed in. So we have our call to view here, and we're nesting that inside of our call to equals. However, there's a shorter way to write this, as you probably know, because we've done it before, and that is using ramda.compose. And of course we can do this because the single parameter that we're passing into this function is the last parameter in the innermost nested function. So we can write this again by saying ramda.compose, and we'll compose r.equals for e.target.value, and we'll compose that with r.view for value. And as you can see, it actually isn't any shorter at all. But the nice thing about this is it's point free, which means we have no parameters we're passing in. And this does make it a little bit more flexible. And it's just a more functional style. So we're going to use isPermission that way. So this will return true if the object that we're looking at here is the one that was just changed, and therefore the one that we need to update. So now let's write a function that will actually change that permission. So we'll call this changePermission. And this is just going to be ramda.set. And what we can do is set the value of the checked lens. So we're setting the checked property on an object. What are we going to set it to? We're going to set it to e.target.checked. And we're not going to pass an object as the last parameter. And that means we're going to get a curried function here, which allows us to pass any object to change permission, and it will have its checked property set to whatever value the checkbox is currently at. So now, let's write another function that is really just a wrapper for change permission. Change permission is used when we know that we have the right object that we want to change the permission on. But what we're going to have to do is loop over all the permissions in the array and ask one by one, is this the one we want to update? So what we can do is we have a function called checkPermission, and we'll use ramda.ifElse. And as you may remember from a previous video, ifElse takes a function as the first parameter, and it will pass its parameter to if-else. If true is returned, it will run the function that is the second parameter. If false is returned, it will run the function that is the third parameter. So as you might guess, we can use isPerm as the first function. So what we're going to get here is a permission object. We'll pass it to if-else. If-else will run it through isPerm. If isPerm returns true, then this is the permission that we need to update. So we'll run change permission, right, to change the value of the checked property on this object. If it's not the permission we need to change, then we can just return it as it is. And the function for that is ramda.identity. Okay, so now we could use checkPerm to map over an array of permissions, and it will only change the one that we're trying to change. So let's write one more helper function here, and that is going to be update group. Remember, we have a list of keys in our original object here, and once we call two pairs on them, we're going to have an array which has a series of nested arrays, each nested array representing a group, with the group name being its first parameter and the group values being its second parameter. So update group is going to take one of these inside arrays and update that. So what we can do here is use the lens function ramda.over. Remember, over is just like set, except it takes a function to run as the second parameter instead of just a value. So we're going to do this over the perms lens. Now this is going to get, as I said, an inner array here, and we're really only interested in changing the second value, index of 1, in that array, which is the array of permissions. So we use this permissions lens right here to just focus on the second object inside of that array. And what we're going to do for that, we're going to call ramda.map, and we're going to map over that. And what function are we going to map? You guessed it, it's check permissions. So there we go. These are all the helper functions that we're going to need. And that means we can write our final function, which is going to be update data. This is actually going to be another ramda.compose, but it's going to be very simple. We'll start by converting our object from an object to an array of arrays using toPairs. Each one of those pairs in there represents one of our groups. So we can map over each one of those groups and call update group. Finally, once the groups have been updated, we can do ramda.fromPairs to convert this back into an object. And that's all. Once we pass our data to update data, it will be updated to represent the new values here. So what we can do at the bottom here is say OnChange, which remember is the function that we passed as a property to checklist. And we can call update data within here, and we will pass it the data. Okay, so now if I open up our console here, we should be able to see this in action. I will go ahead and click run. And now if I click to check a box, you can see that I checked the group 1 permission 2. So let's open up the object that we get returned. Inside of group 1, let's look at the second permission here. Group 1 permission 2, you can see that checked equals true. Now, of course, the checkbox itself doesn't change because we don't have Redux in place here to allow us to call an action to change the state in the store and then have that trickle back through our object. So if I go ahead and click other objects here, you can see that we are getting an object printed out in the console every time I click a checkbox. However, the checkboxes themselves aren't updating, but that's okay. We can see that everything is working, and our onChange function here receives data in the very same format that it is passing it into the checklist as, just changed according to the user's actions. And that is exactly what we wanted out of this checklist component. So that means this checklist component is complete. I've been having a lot of fun recently learning Ramda and doing some problem solving in this functional style. And the question I've been asking myself is it worth it to write your code in this way? I haven't seen very much code written in this style out in the wild. It's quite a different way of programming, at least within the JavaScript community. So is it worth it to basically relearn the way you problem solve in programming? I'm not sure. I'm still trying to figure that out myself. So if you have any opinions on that, let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I'll see you later.